The sun had barely risen over the quiet town of Carlisle in northern England when the local police made a dramatic arrest that would haunt the community for years. Thomas Whitman, a respected businessman, was led from his Georgian-style home in handcuffs, his face etched with confusion and anger. The charge was severe, alleged involvement in an international drug smuggling ring. For his wife, Mary, and their 18-year-old daughter, Jane, the arrest brought life as they knew it to a standstill. The once secure life they cherished was shattered in an instant, replaced by anxiety, isolation, and an uncertain future. Enter Detective Inspector David Harper. Assigned to the high-profile case, David was well known throughout the region for his charisma and charm. A seasoned officer in his 40s, he had a knack for blending authority with compassion, making him a natural confidant for the victims and families involved in his investigations. He arrived on their doorstep, offering support to Mary and Jane under the guise of keeping them updated on Thomas's legal proceedings. But his intentions were far from honorable. From the first visit, his gaze lingered too long, and his support quickly evolved into a dark obsession. Mary was fragile, emotionally wrecked by her husband's arrest and the town's judgmental eyes. David sensed her vulnerability and preyed upon it with precision. His words were laced with comfort and reassurance, hinting that he could look out for her and Jane during this difficult time. Mary, desperate for an ally, slowly began to trust him, her dependence on his presence growing stronger with each visit. Over the next few weeks, David became a regular at the Whitman home. He came under the pretense of bringing news about Thomas's case, but each visit was carefully orchestrated. He cultivated an atmosphere of safety, using his authority to weave himself into their lives. Mary, in her grief and desperation, found herself drawn to his confidence and warmth. What began as innocent conversations soon transformed into late-night talks, and before she knew it, Mary was entangled in an affair. Her loneliness found solace in David's arms, and despite the guilt gnawing at her, she convinced herself that she had no choice. David was her only hope. But David's ambitions didn't stop with Mary. In truth, it was Jane who had caught his eye from the beginning. Young and beautiful, Jane had an air of innocence that David found intoxicating. As her mother became preoccupied with his attention, David began focusing on Jane, shifting his visits to times when she would be home alone. His demeanor toward her was different, gentler, more tender, as if he were grooming her, preparing her for something she couldn't yet understand. At first, Jane welcomed David's kindness. In the wake of her father's arrest, she felt isolated, burdened with whispers behind her back at school, and shunned by friends who feared association with her family's disgrace. David's attention felt like a lifeline. He brought her small gifts, often under the excuse of something from the evidence room that wasn't valuable enough to be missed. He charmed her with stories from his life as a police officer, feeding her tales of bravery and intrigue. But there was a darkness to his kindness, an edge that Jane could not see. Each act of generosity was a calculated move, pulling her deeper into his web. Soon, David's visits became a secret between them. He would ask her to keep their conversations from her mother, making her feel special, as though she were his confidant. Jane, naive and craving connection, complied, unaware of how her innocence was being manipulated. One evening, Jane discovered something that would change everything. She came home early from a friend's house to find David and her mother in an intimate embrace. Shocked and devastated, she fled before they noticed her, her heart pounding with a mix of anger, betrayal, and confusion. The man who had become her protector, her source of comfort, was also betraying her mother's trust. Jane was furious, but more than that, she felt humiliated. She had been made a fool, and she didn't know who to turn to. Jane confronted Mary the next morning, her words sharp and dripping with betrayal. "How could you? After everything Dad's done for us, you're with him. Mary was at a loss. In her mind, David was the only support they had left. She tried to explain, to justify her actions, but Jane refused to listen. The rift between mother and daughter grew, deepening as David continued his manipulations, fostering an environment where neither could trust the other. David, sensing the tension between them, exploited it further. He told Mary that Jane was acting out and seemed to be getting into trouble, planting seeds of doubt about her daughter's behavior. At the same time, he told Jane that her mother was unstable and needed David's help, making her feel like her mother was dependent on him. Each lie he fed them drove a wedge deeper between mother and daughter, isolating them and ensuring they both remained reliant on him. It wasn't long before Jane's dependence on David shifted from emotional to physical. Confused and vulnerable, she found herself drawn into a relationship with him, a dark and twisted affair cloaked in secrecy. Jane convinced herself that it was love, that David understood her in ways no one else could. But in reality, she was trapped, a pawn in David's calculated scheme. Several weeks later, Jane made a startling discovery that would set the stage for the tragedy to come. She was pregnant. Frightened and unsure, she decided to confide in David, hoping he would offer reassurance and guidance. But David's reaction was cold, calculating. He knew that a pregnancy would ruin everything. His career, his carefully curated image, and his control over the Whitman family would all crumble if the truth came out. David knew he had to act fast. He assured Jane he would take care of everything, and insisted she tell no one, not even her mother. Jane, naively trusting him, agreed. Little did she know, David had no intention of helping her. He saw only one solution to protect himself. As David plotted his next move, Mary began noticing changes in Jane's behavior. She seemed withdrawn, more anxious than ever. But when Mary tried to reach out, Jane pulled further away, dismissing her mother's concerns. Mary, haunted by her own guilt, was helpless, watching her daughter slip further into David's control. David's grip on both women tightened, and his visits grew more erratic and secretive. He no longer hid his disdain for the family, his mask slipping as he realized that his perfect plan was spiraling out of control. The power he once held over Mary and Jane now felt like a burden, one he was desperate to shed. But the story doesn't end there. Unbeknownst to David, Jane had confided in a close friend, revealing her pregnancy and her fears about David's reaction. The friend, shocked and concerned, encouraged Jane to leave town, to escape the toxic grasp David held over her. Jane hesitated, torn between loyalty, fear, and a faint hope that David might yet come around. This set the stage for the fateful night. David, sensing that Jane might turn against him, decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. The night was dark and silent as Jane stepped out into the cool evening air, her hands trembling. She hadn't wanted to meet David, but his message had sounded urgent. He'd promised to finally set things right, and despite her fears, she found herself drawn to him one last time, hoping for a solution that didn't involve running or hiding. David waited for her near an abandoned dock by the River Eden, far enough from town to avoid any prying eyes. As Jane approached, she saw the familiar figure standing by the water, his face hidden in shadow. The dock was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft lapping of the river against the wooden posts. David's eyes, once warm and reassuring, now gleamed with a cold determination she hadn't seen before. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. Jane's heart pounded as she glanced around, feeling more alone than she'd ever felt. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. "David, I thought you wanted to talk about our future," Jane stammered, her voice barely audible. She hoped he would give her reassurance, even a shred of the affection he had shown in their earlier days. But David's expression didn't soften. "Future," he murmured, a bitter smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "Do you really think we have a future, Jane?" A sick feeling twisted in her stomach. She took a step back, but David moved closer, blocking her path. She could see the flash of anger in his eyes, the panic he was trying so hard to hide. "You're a liability, Jane. You and your mother both," he spat, his voice hardening. "If anyone found out about us, about this," he gestured toward her stomach, "my entire life would be over." Jane's face paled as the reality of his words sank in. "But you said you cared about me, about us." Her voice wavered, thick with disbelief and fear. David laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed across the empty dock. "Care? Jane, you were just convenient. I've risked too much for you already." Jane took another step back, her mind racing, realizing she was trapped with a man she no longer recognized. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but before she could react, David lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with a grip that felt like iron. "David, please, you don't have to do this," she pleaded, struggling against him. But his hold tightened as he dragged her closer to the edge of the dock, his face contorted with desperation and rage. "Stop fighting, Jane," he hissed. "It'll be over soon. No one will ever find you here." Jane thrashed, kicking and clawing at him, her survival instincts kicking in with a force she didn't know she possessed. She managed to wrench one hand free, scratching at his face, drawing blood. He cursed, momentarily loosening his grip, and she seized the opportunity to break away, stumbling toward the narrow path that led back to town. But David was faster. He caught up to her within seconds, knocking her to the ground. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the darkness, as he raised a large rock, his eyes wild and unhinged. Jane barely had time to shield herself as he brought the rock down, again and again, until the dock was stained with blood. Panting, David staggered back, dropping the rock as he surveyed the gruesome scene before him. Jane lay motionless, her face pale beneath the dark smear of blood. The reality of what he had done washed over him, but there was no time for regret. He had to hide the evidence. In a desperate frenzy, he dragged Jane's lifeless body toward the edge of the dock, pushing her into the river, watching as the current began to carry her away. He wiped his hands on his coat, the chill in the air doing nothing to quell the icy fear creeping through him. He had silenced Jane, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone began asking questions. Unbeknownst to him, Mary had suspected something was wrong. She had seen the way David's behavior had shifted in recent weeks, his visits becoming increasingly sporadic, his demeanor cold and distant. She knew her daughter had been keeping secrets, but she had no idea how deep the betrayal ran. When Jane didn't return that night, Mary's concern quickly turned to terror. She spent the next morning frantically searching, asking neighbors, calling Jane's friends, but no one had seen her. Desperation drove her to confront David directly. When he finally showed up, his face pale and his clothes disheveled, she cornered him, demanding to know where Jane was. David tried to deflect, insisting that Jane had probably run off to escape the stress of her father's arrest. But Mary wasn't convinced. She could see the fear in his eyes, the telltale signs of a man hiding something far darker. Fueled by a mother's intuition, she began her own search, retracing the path to the river where Jane had been seen last. There, on the edge of the dock, she found a bloodstain, barely visible but unmistakable. Her heart stopped as she pieced together what must have happened, the horrific reality dawning on her. Unable to contain her rage, Mary returned to confront David one final time. She found him at his office, disheveled and tense, his eyes darting nervously as she stormed in. Without a word, she threw down the scarf she had found near the dock, a scarf Jane had worn the night she disappeared. "You did this," she whispered, her voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "You killed my daughter." David tried to deny it, but his excuses crumbled under the weight of Mary's accusation. Desperation flared in his eyes as he realized she knew the truth. In a last-ditch effort to silence her, he lunged forward, but Mary was ready. She had brought a knife from her kitchen, hidden in her coat pocket, and as David charged, she struck, the blade slicing through his side. David staggered back, clutching his wound, his face twisted in agony. Mary didn't stop. She unleashed years of suppressed anger, each strike fueled by the betrayal, the lies, the loss of her daughter. By the time she was done, David lay lifeless on the floor, his blood pooling around him. The sound of sirens grew in the distance as Mary stood over his body, the reality of her actions sinking in. She didn't resist as the police arrived, her hands still stained with David's blood. She told them everything, the manipulation, the abuse, the murder of her daughter. As the officers led her away, she felt a strange sense of peace. Justice, in some twisted form, had been served. In the aftermath, the small town of Carlisle was rocked by the revelations that unfolded. The investigation uncovered David's long history of predatory behavior, his manipulation of Mary and Jane, his abuse of power. The details of Jane's tragic end cast a shadow over the town, leaving the community shaken and outraged.